Livy, Book 33, 16. Before the battle at Cynoscephalae, Lucius Quinctius summoned to Corcyra the leaders of the Acarnanians, the only people in Greece to have remained within the Macedonian alliance, and here he made a start on changing their allegiance. Two major factors had kept the Acarnanians loyal to their treaty of friendship with the king. First, the inbred fidelity of their race, and secondly, their fear and hatred of the Aetolians. An assembly of the Acarnanians was called at Leucas, but not all their constituent peoples came, and those who had come were not in agreement. However, their leading men and magistrates succeeded in getting a private decree passed, which authorized an alliance with Rome. This enraged all who had been absent, and at this time of national unrest, Philip dispatched to Leucas two prominent Acarnanians, Androcles and Epidemus. These were able not only to have the decree sanctioning the Roman alliance rescinded, but also to have Archelaus and Bianor, both notable members of their people, condemned in the council on a charge of treason for having proposed the decree. They also had the praetor Zeuxis' appointment annulled for having introduced the motion. The condemned men followed a course of action that was impetuous, but which proved successful. Although their friends urged them to accept the situation and join the Romans in Corcyra, they decided instead to present themselves before the crowded assembly and either assuage its anger by this gesture or accept whatever came to them. When they entered the packed meeting, there was at first a murmuring and buzz from the surprised audience, but silence soon fell, from respect for the men's former status as much as pity for their present misfortune. Granted permission to speak, they began in suppliant tones, but as their speech progressed and they came to the point of vindicating themselves against the charges, they spoke with the confidence that their innocence gave them finally, even going so far as to make complaints and criticisms about the unjust and cruel treatment to which they had been subjected. Such was the impression they made that the crowded assembly reversed all the decisions that had been taken against them, while still voting to return to the alliance with Philip and reject a treaty with the Romans. 17. Such were the decisions taken at Leucas. This was the capital of Acarnania, and the place where all its peoples came for their assembly. So when news of this sudden change of heart was brought to the legate Flaminius, So when news of this sudden change of heart was brought to the legate Flamininus in Corcyra, he immediately set sail with his fleet for Leucas, anchoring off the so-called Heraeum. From here he advanced to the city walls, taking along artillery and siege engines of all kinds used for storming towns, in the belief that the townspeople's feelings could change with the initial panic. When there was no indication of readiness or for peace, the legate proceeded to erect siege sheds and towers and to bring the battering ram towards the walls. So, personal footnote. Lucas, it's spelled Leucas. Flamininus, spelled Flaminus. Heraeum, spelled Heraeum. And Corcyra, Corcyra. End of personal footnote. Situated in its entirety between Aetolia and Epirus, Acarnania faces west towards the Sicilian Sea. Leucadia, which is now an island separated from Acarnania by a shallow man-made strait, was at that time a peninsula attached to Acarnania at its western end by a narrow isthmus, some 500 paces in length and no more than 120 in width. Lucas lies on the narrow strait, set on a hill that faces east towards Acarnania. The lower reaches of the city are flat, lying beside the sea that divides Leucadia from Acarnania. At this point, both land and sea render it vulnerable, for the shallow waters here resemble a pool more than a sea, while the plain is made up of soft earth easy to dig. As a result, the walls were collapsing at several points simultaneously, either undermined or else knocked down by the ram. But if the city itself was an easy proposition for its assailants, the spirit of the enemy was indomitable. Day and night they applied themselves to rebuilding the shattered portions of the wall, to blocking the gaps left where it collapsed, to joining battle with vigor, and to protecting their walls with their weapons rather than themselves with their ramparts. In fact, they would have drawn out the siege longer than the Romans had anticipated, but for some exiles of Italian stock living in Lucas, who came down from the citadel to admit the Roman soldiers. Even so, the Leucadians, who drew up their battle line in the Forum, held the Romans for some time in pitched battle as they came swooping down with a great commotion from their higher position. In the meantime, the fortifications were taken by scaling ladders at several points, and the Romans clambered into the city over the stones strewn on the ground and the fallen walls, while by now the legate himself, at the head of the large column of men, had surrounded the battling Leucadians. Then some were cut down, encircled by their foes. Others threw down their arms and surrendered to the victor. A few days later, when news came of the battle that had been fought at Cynoscephalae, all the peoples of Acarnania capitulated to the legate. 18. At this same time as Philip's fortunes waned everywhere simultaneously, the Rhodians also intended reclaiming from him part of the mainland called the Perea, which had belonged to their forefathers. To effect this, they sent out the praetor Pisistratus in command of 800 Achaean infantry and some 1,800 auxiliary troops drawn from different races: Gauls, Menusatae, Pasotae, Tarmiani, and Therae from the Perea, and Laodiceni from Asia. With these troops, Pisistratus seized Tendeba, which was strategically situated in the territory of Stratonicia, without the knowledge of the king's forces who were stationed at Thera. He was joined at the opportune moment by an auxiliary force, which he had requested specifically for this operation. 1,000 Achaean infantry along with 100 cavalry, all under the command of Theoxenus. To recover this fortified town, the king's prefect, Dinocrates, first moved his camp towards Tendeba itself, and from there to a second stronghold called Astragos, also in Stratonicean territory. He then recalled to the place all the widely scattered Macedonian garrisons, as well as the Thessalian auxiliaries from Stratonicea itself, and proceeded to Albanda. He then recalled to the place all the widely scattered Macedonian garrisons, as well as the Thessalian auxiliaries from Stratonicea itself, and proceeded to Alabanda, where his enemy were situated. The Rhodians did not refuse the fight, and so, with their camps established in close proximity to each other, the two sides immediately came forward for battle. Dinocrates set 500 Macedonians on his right wing, and the Agrianes on the left, bringing into the center the men drawn from the garrisons in the fortified towns, Carians for the most part, and placing cavalry and Cretan and Thracian auxiliaries about the wings. The Rhodians had Achaeans on the right wing, and mercenaries, a hand-picked body of infantry, on the left. Their center was made up of an assortment of auxiliaries drawn from several races, while the cavalry and such light infantry as they had covered the wings. On the day the battle lines of each side merely took up a position on the banks of a torrent, which flowed between them, at that time with low water level, and after hurling a few javelins, retired to camp. The following day, drawn up in the same formation, they fought a battle considerably more fierce than the one would have expected, given the numbers participating, for there were on each side no more than 3,000 infantry and about 100 cavalry. But in the fight they were not just evenly matched in numbers and equipment, but had equal fortitude and similar hopes of victory. The Achaeans initiated the action, crossing the torrent and attacking the Agrianes, after which the entire line crossed the stream almost at a run. For a long time it was an even fight. By virtue of their numbers, the Achaeans, who totaled 1,000, forced their 400 adversaries to give ground. Then, when the left wing buckled, they all put pressure on the right. The Macedonians could not be budged for as long as the ranks and their compressed phalanx, as it were, held firm. But when their left flank became exposed, they attempted to bring their lances round to face the enemy coming at them from the side, which immediately disoriented them. At first there was chaos in their ranks, then they turned tail, and finally they threw down their weapons and took off in headlong flight. They ran in the direction of Bargilae, which was where Dinocrates also fled. The Rhodians pursued them for the remainder of the day, and then retired to camp. It is widely accepted that if the victors had immediately headed for Stratonicea, that city could have been taken without a struggle. The opportunity for this was lost while time was wasted on the recapture of fortified towns and villages of the Perea. In the meantime, those holding Stratonicia with a garrison regained their spirit, and soon Dinocrates also entered the town with the troops which had survived the battle. From that point on, besieging and attacking the city proved fruitless, and it could not be taken until considerably later, when it fell to Antiochus. Such were events in Thessaly, Achaia, and Asia, occurring at roughly the same time. 19. Philip had heard that from disdain for his now badly shaken empire, the Dardanians had crossed his frontiers and were completely laying waste the upper stretches of Macedonia. He was under pressure almost the world over, as fortune dogged him and his people at every turn. Even so, he felt that being dispossessed of the throne of Macedonia would be a fate worse than death. He therefore conducted a hurried levy of troops throughout the cities of Macedonia, and at the head of 6,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, overpowered his enemy with a surprise attack in the area of Stobai in Paeonia. Large numbers of men were massacred in battle, even more as they roamed through the fields, hungry for booty. Paeonia, spelled Paeonia. Those who had the opportunity to flee returned to their countries without even risking a fight. Philip retired to Thessalonica, the confidence of his people restored by the single campaign, which was at variance with his fortunes elsewhere. The timely ending of the war with the Carthaginians, which saved the Romans from having to fight them and Philip at the same time, was not as opportune as Philip's defeat, at a point when Antiochus was already fomenting war from his base in Syria. Apart from the fact that it was easier for Rome to fight these enemies separately than if the two had joined forces, there was also in that same period an armed uprising and great upheaval in Spain. The previous summer, Antiochus had wrested from Ptolemy's control and brought into his own power all the city-states in Coele, Syria, and had then retired to Antioch for the winter, which proved no less active a season for him than the summer had been. Exploiting all the resources of his kingdom, he had amassed huge land and sea forces, and at the beginning of spring he sent ahead his two sons, Ardes and Mithridates, overland with an army, ordering them to wait for him at Sardis. He then set out himself with a fleet of 100 ships with decks plus 200 lighter vessels, Cyprian cutters, and pinnaces. His aim was to strike at the cities under Ptolemy's control all along the coast of Cilicia, Lycia, and Coria, and at that same time to assist Philip, for the war against Philip was not yet finished, with his army and his ships. 20. The people of Rhodes have performed many exceptional exploits on land and sea out of loyalty towards the Roman people and on behalf of the entire Greek community, but none more glorious than their feat of that summer. Undaunted by the tremendous war that threatened, they sent envoys to the king to warn him not to pass beyond Chelidoniae, a promontory in Cilicia famous for the treaty concluded in days of old between Athens and the kings of Persia. If Antiochus did not keep his fleet and land forces behind that line, they said they would march against him, not from any animosity towards him, but to prevent him joining up with Philip and obstructing the Roman liberation of Greece. At the time, Antiochus was investing Corcyraeum with siege works. At that time, Antiochus was investing Corcyraeum with siege works. Corcyraeum, spelled Coracesium. He had already taken Zephyrium, Solo, Aphrodisias, Coriscus, and, after skirting around Anamurium, also a promontory in Cilicia, Selinus. But though all these and other fortified towns on that coastline had submitted without a fight, either from fear or by choice, Corcyraeum had unexpectedly shut its gates to him and now kept him bogged down there. Here he gave an audience to envoys from Rhodes, and though the embassy's mission was such as to infuriate the king, he nonetheless controlled his anger and replied that he would send representatives to Rhodes. These he would instruct to renew the ancient bonds that existed between himself and his ancestors and that state, and tell the Rhodians not to feel apprehensive about the king's coming, that there would be no harm or treachery involved either for the Rhodians or their allies. For he said he would not violate his alliance with Rome, and he cited in support of his commitment his recent delegation to Rome, and the decisions and answers made by the Senate, which redounded to his credit. It so happened that the ambassadors had at that point returned from Rome. They were heard and sent back with courtesy as the situation demanded, for it was as yet uncertain how the war with Philip would turn out. While the king's envoys were discussing these matters in the assembly of the Rhodians, word came that the war had been terminated at Senoskaphalai. On receiving the news, the Rhodians, who now were freed from fear with regard to Philip, abandoned their plan of confronting Antiochus with their fleet. But they did not abandon their other purpose, that of preserving the independence of the cities allied to Ptolemy, which were then facing the threat of war with Antiochus. Some of these they helped with military aid, others with advance warnings and intelligence on the movements of the enemy. And they were responsible for maintaining the independence of the peoples of Caunus, Myndus, Halicarnassus, and Samos. A detailed report of military operations in these spots cannot really be justified when I am barely capable of providing an account of those relevant to the war fought by the Romans. 21. In this same period, Attalus fell ill at Thebes and was taken back to Pergamon, where he died at the age of 71, after a rule of 44 years. Apart from his wealth, fate had given this man nothing to encourage any hopes of becoming a king, but a judicious and at the same time generous use of his riches. He made himself appear fit for a throne, first in his own eyes and then in others. Later, he vanquished the Gauls in a single battle, a race all the more feared in Asia at that point for having only just arrived. He then assumed the title king, and consistently revealed a disposition in keeping with the title's majesty. He ruled his subjects with consummate justice. He demonstrated a unique loyalty towards his allies. He was easygoing in his relationship with his wife and children, 4 of whom survived him, and he was tolerant and generous with his friends. He left his kingdom on such a firm and solid footing that his family's sovereignty over it lasted to the 3rd generation. Such was the state of affairs in Asia, Greece, and Macedonia, when the war with Philip was only just finished, or at least peace had not been concluded. Meanwhile, a momentous war broke out in farther Spain. Marcus Helvius, governor of the province, informed the Senate by letter that 2 minor kings, Colchis and Licinius, had taken up arms, and that 17 towns had joined Colchis, while the powerful cities of Carmo and Bardo had joined Licinius. On the coast, he said, the Malacini and Sextani, all Bactria, and the tribes which had not yet revealed their sympathies would join the uprising of their neighbors. This letter was read out to the praetor Marcus Sergius, who had jurisdiction in cases between citizens and foreigners, and the senators then decreed that, after the elections for the praetorship, the praetor, to whom the province of Spain was allotted, should bring the question of the war in Spain before the Senate at the earliest opportunity. 22. In this same period, the consuls reached Rome. They convened the Senate in the temple of Bologna, and made a request for a triumph in recognition of their military achievements, only to be faced with a counter-request from the plebeian tribunes, Gaius Antinius Labeo and Gaius Afranius, that the consuls hold separate debates on their triumphs. They would not, they said, permit a joint motion on the issue in case equal credit be accorded when the merits were not equal. Quintus Minucius made the point that both consuls had been allotted the province of Italy, and that he and his colleague had conducted the campaign with shared purpose and strategy, and Gaius Cornelius added that when the Boii advanced against him over the Po with the intention of aiding the Insurbres and Cenomani, it was only his colleagues' plundering of the villages and fields that made them turn back to protect their own property. The tribunes acknowledged that Gaius Cornelius's achievements in the war were so significant that a triumph for him could no more be in doubt than could the honors to be paid to the immortal gods. Even so, they added, neither he nor any other citizen had so much influence or power as to bestow, after gaining a well-earned triumph for himself, the same distinction, when it was not well earned, upon a colleague with the impertinence to request it. Quintus Minucius had fought some inconsequential battles, barely worth the mention, amongst the Ligurians, and in Gaul he had lost a large number of men. They also mentioned the military tribunes of the 4th Legion, Titus Ioventius and Gnaeus Ligurius. These, they said, had lost their lives in Minucius' defeat, along with many other brave men, both citizens and allies. As for the capitulation of the small number of towns and villages, this was all concocted and fabricated on the spot, and without corroboration. This wrangling between the consuls and the tribunes took up 2 days, after which the consuls, frustrated by the doggedness of the tribunes, referred their requests separately to the Senate. 23. The decision to award Gaius Cornelius his triumph was unanimous, and the people of Placentia and Cremona lent their support to the consul. They offered him their thanks and reminded the Senate that it was Cornelius who had raised their siege, most of them adding that he had also delivered them from slavery when they were in the hands of the enemy. As for Quintus Minucius, he merely tried out his motion, and then, seeing the Senate entirely opposed to him, declared that he would celebrate a triumph on the Alban Mount, which was within the rights of his consular authority, and also sanctioned by the precedent of many distinguished men. Gaius Cornelius celebrated his triumph over the Isubris and Cenomani in the course of his magistracy. He had many military standards put on display, large quantities of Gallic spoils transported on captured wagons, and many Gallic noblemen led before his chariot. Amongst them, some say, the Carthaginian general Hamilcar. But what attracted most attention was the troop of colonists from Cremona and Placentia, who followed the chariot with freedmen caps on their heads. Cornelius had 237,500 bronze asses carried along in his triumphal parade, and 79,000 silver coins stamped with the biga. 70 bronze asses were distributed to each of the soldiers, twice that amount to each cavalryman and centurion. The consul, Quintus Minucius, celebrated his triumph over the Ligurians and Gallic Boii on the Alban Mount, a less exalted affair by virtue of its location, the reputation of the accomplishments involved, and the fact that everyone knew the expenses for it were not covered by the public purse. In terms of military standards, wagons and spoils, however, it almost rivaled the other. Even the sums of money involved were roughly equal. 254,000 bronze coins and 53,200 silver coins, stamped with the biga, were carried in the procession, and the common soldiers, centurions, and cavalrymen were each given the same amount as Minucius's colleague had given to his men. 24. After the triumph, the consular elections were held, in which Lucius Furius Porpureo and Marcus Claudius Marcellus were elected. The next day the following were elected praetor: Quintus Fabius Boteo, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, Quintus Minucius, Thermus Manius, Acilius Glabrio, Lucius Apustius Pholo, and Gaius Laelius. Towards the end of the year, a letter arrived from Titus Quinctius with the news that he had fought a pitched battle with Philip in Thessaly, and that the enemy army had been vanquished and put to flight. This letter was read out by the praetor Marcus Sergius in the Senate first of all, and then later, on the authorization of the Senate, in a public assembly. And 5 days of public prayers were prescribed in thanks for the successful campaign. Shortly afterwards, envoys came from both Titus Quinctius and King Philip. The Macedonians were taken out of the city to the public villa, where they were housed and officially entertained, and then they were granted a meeting with the Senate at the temple of Bellona. The proceedings here were not long, the Macedonians stating that the king would abide by any decision of the Senate. In accordance with ancestral custom, a board of 10 commissioners was appointed in consultation with whom the general Titus Quinctius was to formulate peace terms for Philip, and a rider was added that Publius Sulpicius and Publius Villius, former consular governors of Macedonia, be amongst these. That day the people of Cosa requested an increase in the number of their colonists. The enrollment of 1,000 was authorized, with the condition that none be included who had been an enemy of Rome in the period following the consulship of Publius Cornelius and Tiberius Sempronius. 25. The Roman games were that year held in the circus and theater by the Curo Aediles, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Gnaeus Manlius Vulso. The performances were more lavish than on other occasions, and were also watched with greater pleasure because of the military successes, and they were repeated 3 times in their entirety. The plebeian games were repeated 7 times. These were put on by Manius Acilius Glabrio and Gaius Laelius, who erected 3 bronze statues of Ceres, Liber, and Libera from the money taken in fines. When Lucius Furius and Marcus Claudius Marcellus began their consulship, the question of their provinces arose. The Senate was resolved to assign Italy to the 2 of them, but the consuls insisted that they draw lots for Macedonia along with Italy. Marcellus was the more ambitious to gain the province, and he declared that the peace was bogus and a sham, that the king would go to war again in the army were removed from there. This had made the Senate think twice about the recommendation, and the consul might possibly have won the day but for the tribunes of the people, Quintus Marcius Ralla and Gaius Antonius Labeo. These said that they would use their veto unless they themselves had first brought before the people the issue of whether peace with Philip was in accordance with the people's wishes and instructions. The motion was put to the people on the Capitol, and all 35 tribes voted in favor of it. In addition, the arrival of bad news from Spain actually served to increase public jubilation over the conclusion of peace in Macedonia. A letter was published announcing the defeat of the proconsul Gaius Sempronius Tuditanus in battle in Hither Spain. The letter stated that Tuditanus' army had been vanquished and put to flight, that many eminent men had lost their lives in the field, and that Tuditanus was carried from the fray with a serious wound, only to die shortly afterwards. The 2 consuls were assigned Italy as their province and given the legions that had been commanded by the previous consuls. They were also instructed to enroll 4 new legions, 2 city legions, and 2 to be sent wherever the Senate decided. Orders were also issued for Titus Quinctius Flamininus to govern his province with the same army, and it was decided that the earlier extension of his imperium appeared sufficient. 26. In the Praetorian allotment of provinces, which followed, Lucius Apustius Fullo gained the urban jurisdiction, and Manius Acilius Glabrio, citizen foreign affairs. Quintus Fabius Buteo received farther Spain, Quintus Minucius Thermus hither Spain, Gaius Laelius Sicily, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus Sardinia. It was decided that the consuls should give to Quintus Fabius Buteo and Quintus Minucius, to whom the Spanish provinces had fallen, 1 each of the 4 legions which they had raised. the consuls selecting these legions, along with 4,000 infantry and 300 cavalry of the Allies and Latin League. These praetors were instructed to leave for their provinces at the earliest possible opportunity. War now broke out again in Spain, 4 years after it had been last brought to an end, along with the Punic War. This was almost a new war because it was the first time the Spaniards had commenced hostilities on their own initiative, without Carthaginian forces or a Carthaginian leader. But before the two praetors could set out for it, or the consuls leave Rome themselves, they received orders to undertake the customary ritual of expiating the prodigies that they were being reported. A Roman knight, Publius Villius, had been killed by lightning along with his horse while starting a journey into Sabine territory. The temple of Feronia in the area of Capena had been struck by lightning. The tips of the two javelins had ignited near the temple of Moneta, and a wolf had entered Rome by the Esquiline Gate, had run into the Forum through the most populous part of the city, and made its way through the Vicus Tuscus, and then the Sermalis, before escaping, almost untouched, by way of the Porta Capena. Full-grown victims were used for the expiation of these prodigies. 27. In this same period, Gnaeus Cornelius Blasio, governor of Hither Spain before Gaius Sempronius Tuditanus, entered the city celebrating an ovation which had been authorized by senatorial decree. Carried before him were 1,515 pounds of gold, 20,000 pounds of silver, and 34,500 denarii in coin. Returning from farther Spain, Lucius Stertonius did not even investigate the prospects of a triumph, but he deposited in the treasury 50,000 pounds of silver, and from the proceeds of the spoils erected 2 arches in the cattle market before the temples of Fortuna and Mater Matuta, respectively, and 1 in the Circus Maximus. He set gilded statues on all 3 arches. Such, more or less, were the events of the winter. During this time Titus Quintius was spending the winter at Elatia. He received numerous petitions from the allies, including the Boeotians, who asked for, and were granted, the restitution of those of their people who had fought on Philip's side. This request was readily granted by Quintius, not because he believed the Boeotians merited it, but because he was now suspicious of Antiochus, and needed to win support for the Roman cause among the city-states. When the men were returned, it quickly became apparent just how little appreciation there was amongst the Boeotians. When the men were returned, it became quickly apparent just how little One more time. When the men were returned, it quickly became apparent just how little appreciation there was amongst the Boeotians. It was to Philip that they sent a deputation to offer their thanks for the return of the men, as if this had been a concession made to them directly, rather than to Quintius and the Romans. They also made a certain Brachyles Boeotarch at the following elections, for the sole reason that he had been general of the Boeotians, who fought on the king's side, and they passed over Zeuxippus, Pisistratus, and others who had fostered the alliance with Rome. Zeuxippus, spelt Zeuxippus. Pisistratus, Pisistratus. Boeotians, spelt Boeotians. You decide. Boeotians, Boeotians, Boeotians. That's the spelling. Boeotians. I know we've covered this before, but I don't think I reached any real distinction in my pronunciation of that name. Some of these are rather difficult, I have to admit, upon first perusal. Anyway, these latter took umbrage at this for the moment, and also harbored anxieties for the future. When that sort of thing happened with the Roman army sitting practically at their gates, they thought that was their situation going to be. When that sort of thing happened with the Roman army sitting practically at their gates, they thought what was their situation going to be when the Romans had departed for Italy and Philip was still close at hand, helping his partisans and ill-disposed to those who had been in the other camp. 28. These men therefore decided to eliminate Brachilius, chief supporter of the king, while they still had Roman armed forces in the vicinity. The time they picked for the coup was when he was on the way home after a public banquet, drunk and in the company of some effeminate men who had been at the dinner, which was attended by many people, to provide entertainment. Brachilius was waylaid by 6 armed men, 3 Italians and 3 Aetolians, and assassinated. Brachilius' companions fled. There was a call for help, and pandemonium broke out as men with torches ran to and fro throughout the city. The assassins slipped away through the nearest gate. At dawn there was an assembly in the theatre as well attended as if it had been convened by prior edict or called by a herald. In public, people angrily claimed that Brachilius had been murdered by the lewd men in his retinue, but in their hearts they had Zeuxippus singled out as the man responsible for the assassination. For the moment they decided Brachilius' companions should be arrested and interrogated. While the search for them was in progress, Zeuxippus coolly made an appearance at the assembly to deflect incrimination from himself. People were wrong, he said, to believe such a heinous murder to be linked to these effeminate men, and he produced many plausible arguments to support his case. With these he convinced some people that if he had felt guilty, he would never have presented himself to the crowd or made mention of the murder, when he was under no pressure to do so. Others, however, were sure that brazenly exposing himself to the charge was simply a way of averting suspicion. Shortly afterwards, Brachilius' innocent companions were tortured. They knew nothing but taking as evidence what everybody believed. They named Zeuxippus, or pronounce Zeuxippus, you decide, spelled Zeuxippus, and Pisistratus. Here we go again. I tell you, some of these names, they really tie your tongue out. They knew nothing but, taking as evidence what everybody believed, they named Zeuxippus and Pisistratus without adding anything to suggest that they actually had some knowledge of the incident. Even so, Zeuxippus fled by night to Tanagra, with one Stratonadus, more from fear of his own conscience than of the evidence supplied by men with no knowledge of the episode. Pisistratus remained in Thebes, with scant regard for the informers. Zeuxippus had a slave who was a go-between and accomplice in the whole affair. Pisistratus feared that he might denounce them, and that very fear induced him to bring his name forward as an informant. He then sent a letter to Zeuxippus to tell him to get the slave confederate out of the way. He seemed less capable of keeping the affair secret than of perpetrating it, he said. The man bearing the letter had been instructed to deliver it to Zeuxippus on the earliest possible occasion, but, not having the opportunity to see him immediately, he passed it to that very slave, believing that he of all Zeuxippus' slaves was the one most faithful to his master. He added that it was a letter from Pisistratus on a matter of particular concern to Zeuxippus. Again, the man bearing the letter had been instructed to deliver it to Zeuxippus on the earliest possible occasion, but, not having the opportunity to see him immediately, he passed it to that very slave, believing that he, of all Zeuxippus' slaves, was the most faithful to his master. He added that it was a letter from Pisistratus on a matter of particular concern to Zeuxippus. Stricken by conscience, the slave swore to deliver it immediately, but instead he opened the letter, and after reading it, fled in panic to Thebes, where he put his statement before the magistrates, worried by the flight of his slave. Zeuxippus moved to Anthedon, which he felt was a safer location for his exile. As for Pisistratus and the others, they were interrogated under torture and put to death.